The Andersons had, for most of the 2 decades they had lived in Maplewood, presented themselves to the world as a family that had more or less figured things out. Richard Anderson, who worked in middle management at a large insurance firm headquartered in St. Paul, commuted every morning in his sensible gray sedan, listened to NPR on the way, and liked to think of himself as the kind of husband and father who provided without fanfare. Claire, who had a degree in English literature she never quite knew what to do with, worked part-time at the library, a job that allowed her to spend afternoons at home when the kids were younger and, more importantly, gave her a reason to leave the house now that they were older. To the neighbors, with their lawn well kept and their children, Anna, 19, and Ethan, 15, respectably mannered at school, the Andersons looked like the sort of household one might expect to see in an advertisement for a mortgage lender. Not glamorous, not wealthy, but stable, ordinary, enviably functional. The trouble with ordinary, of course, is how often it becomes a disguise. Richard, standing in the kitchen late at night with a beer, could sometimes feel that disguise clinging to him, a costume made of routines. The commute, the mortgage payment, the banter about weather with colleagues whose lives looked suspiciously like his own. He was not unhappy, exactly, but he was also not able to remember the last time he had felt anything that might deserve to be called joy. Claire, for her part, had mastered the art of quiet resignation, which in suburban Minnesota was indistinguishable from politeness. She smiled in the grocery store checkout line, she asked about the neighbors' kids, she made chicken casseroles that tasted exactly like everyone else's casseroles. But at night, when she stayed up reading novels whose heroines seemed both braver and more foolish than she had ever allowed herself to be, she wondered what, if anything, her life was supposed to mean. Anna, home from her first year at college, found the entire suburban theater intolerable. She had spent the spring occupying administration buildings with the campus climate justice group, shouting slogans in the rain, discovering the particular intoxication of believing oneself to be morally superior. Returning to Maplewood felt like exile. Her father, with his insurance job, seemed to her a cog in the machinery destroying the planet. Her mother, with her library card and gentle sighs, an enabler of everything Anna despised about middle-class complacency. Ethan, meanwhile, had discovered the anesthetic of video games. With a headset over his ears, a glowing monitor in front of him, and friends who existed primarily as disembodied voices yelling instructions and insults through the internet, he found it easier not to think about school, where he was invisible at best and a target at worst. Wives rarely are. She noticed the change in Richard's cologne, the new shirt he bought without mentioning it, the way his phone seemed permanently face down on the counter. She noticed, too, the subtle withdrawal. How he no longer filled the silence with harmless chatter, how he came home later with the excuse of just finishing up a project. She did not confront him, though. Confrontation required energy, and what Claire had learned, over the long years of marriage, was that silence could be its own kind of weapon. If Richard wanted to live a second life in whispered phone calls and unexplained meetings, let him. She would busy herself with the library, with Ethan's half-hearted homework, with her own interior world. Anna, however, saw everything. Not in the details. She had no idea who Emily was, nor would she have cared, but in the atmosphere of the house. She noticed the brittle edge in her mother's voice, the distracted look in her father's eyes. To Anna, the affair was not a betrayal of Claire so much as a confirmation of what she already believed, that her father was a hypocrite, a man who went to work every day to prop up a system he claimed to despise, who preached stability but couldn't even keep his own marriage intact. When she slammed cabinet doors or rolled her eyes at the dinner table, she wasn't only reacting to his politics or his job. She was reacting to the scent of dishonesty that seemed to seep into the walls. Ethan, in contrast, noticed nothing. Or rather, he noticed everything but processed it in the only way he knew how. By retreating further into his room, into the glowing universe of avatars and missions and digital rewards. He could hear the muted arguments through the wall, the way his father's voice lowered in frustration and his mother's grew icy, but he translated it into background noise, the way one might grow accustomed to traffic or rain. To speak of it would have required a vocabulary of feelings he did not possess, and so he kept his headset on and let the outside world dissolve. There was a moment, one rainy Thursday evening, when Claire nearly broke the silence. Richard had come home late again, smelling faintly of a beer that was not the brand they kept in the fridge. He kissed her on the cheek, an act so automatic it felt like mockery, and she found herself staring at him, wondering whether to ask outright, "Who is she?" But then Ethan shuffled into the kitchen, looking for a snack, and the question died in her throat. Instead she set down the cutting board, wiped her hands on a towel, and asked if he wanted his sandwich toasted. This, she thought, was marriage. The endless substitution of small gestures for the larger words you couldn't bring yourself to say. And Richard, who felt both guilty and strangely alive, convinced himself that as long as no one said anything, nothing was truly happening. Emily was just a friend, a confidant, someone who made the workday bearable. If occasionally his hand brushed hers as they leaned over a file, if occasionally they lingered too long after a drink, what did it matter? He was still coming home, wasn't he? Still paying the bills, still mowing the lawn. He was, he liked to believe, a good man who had simply misplaced some part of himself and was temporarily borrowing it back. The problem with lies, of course, is that they multiply. One small deception requires another to cover it, until the entire structure of family life begins to tilt under the weight. Claire could feel the tilt. Anna could see it. Ethan could sense it without naming it. And Richard was too busy convincing himself of his innocence to realize how close the whole thing was to collapse. Anna came home for the summer carrying not just a duffel bag of wrinkled clothes and dog-eared books but also an arsenal of newly acquired convictions. Her freshman year at Madison had been, in her telling, an unbroken chain of revelations. Seminars where professors dismantled everything she had grown up believing, late-night arguments in dorm lounges where the future of the planet was at stake, rallies where the air smelled of wet cardboard and moral urgency. She had marched, she had shouted, she had posted and reposted until her thumbs ached. Now, standing once again in her childhood bedroom with its faded posters and bookshelf full of novels she had long since outgrown, she felt both triumphant and trapped, like a prophet sent back to her village only to discover that no one cared what she had to say. Her father, predictably, was the first target of her impatience. Richard represented, in her new ideological lexicon, everything broken about America. The corporate machinery, the empty pursuit of stability, the smug denial of climate catastrophe. It was not enough that he paid the bills or that his colleagues respected him. To Anna, those very facts were evidence of complicity. Each evening when he placed his briefcase by the door and loosened his tie, she saw not a weary father but a man who had traded conscience for comfort. Claire, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over. She reminded Anna that not every job could be glamorous, that someone had to keep the world running, that her father's work allowed her to attend a university where she could indulge in the luxury of protest. But Anna heard only justification, the familiar rhetoric of surrender. In her mother's weary pragmatism, she saw not wisdom but capitulation, a life shrunk to the dimensions of a casserole dish. The battleground was the dinner table. What had once been an arena of small talk and half-hearted attempts at family bonding became, with Anna's return, a nightly theater of accusation and defense. "Do you realize your company invests in fossil fuels?" she demanded one evening, stabbing at a plate of salmon Claire had baked. "Every policy you approve, every decision you sign, you're literally helping to cook the planet." Richard, who had just poured himself a glass of white wine, pinched the bridge of his nose. "Anna, I don't approve investments. I'm middle management. I supervise claims. People who get into accidents, people who lose their houses in fires." "Exactly," she cut in. "You clean up the messes caused by the very system you uphold. You're like a janitor in a burning building, except you keep cashing the checks from the arsonists." Ethan, as usual, kept his eyes on his phone under the table, pretending not to listen. But even he couldn't ignore the rising volume, the way his father's jaw tightened, the way his mother's fork clattered softly against her plate as if to remind them all that food was supposed to be eaten, not weaponized. Claire attempted a diversion. "Anna, why don't you tell us about your classes next semester?" But Anna was not interested in diversion. "My classes are about reality. about not hiding behind excuses. Unlike this, she gestured at the table, the suburban kitchen, the carefully arranged normalcy of it all. This house is a bubble. You have no idea how bad things really are. It was not lost on Richard that his daughter, sitting in a house he had worked for decades to afford, eating food purchased with his paycheck, had the luxury to denounce him. He wanted to tell her about the compromises that life demanded, about the humiliations endured in cubicles and conference rooms, about the small victories that made survival possible. But what came out instead was a defensive bark. Maybe when you've actually worked a day in your life, you'll understand how the world works. Anna laughed, sharp and humorless. That's exactly what they want you to say. Keep your head down, don't question anything, collect your paycheck, and die without having changed a damn thing. Claire closed her eyes. Ethan slipped away upstairs, and Richard, staring at his daughter's furious face, felt the gap between them widen into something unbridgeable. The irony was that Anna's righteousness carried with it the same certainty that Richard himself had once wielded in his 20s. He had marched too, though for causes now forgotten, had believed too that he was destined to live differently from his parents. What he saw in Anna was not only defiance but also a mirror, and he hated her for reminding him of the person he had failed to become. Over the weeks, the pattern repeated. Anna woke late, drifted through the house with headphones blasting music her parents couldn't name, disappeared for evenings with old high school friends who had likewise returned with radical theories and piercing contempt. She accused her mother of domestic complicity, when Claire reminded her to take her dishes to the sink. She accused her father of cowardice when he tried to explain why quitting his job wasn't an option. Yet beneath the shouting, there lingered a kind of fragile longing. To her mild shock, he had replied to her tentative message. Mark was divorced now, living 2 towns over, selling real estate. Their exchanges began innocently enough, updates about classmates, complaints about traffic, but soon slipped into the dangerous territory of memory. "Remember that concert we skipped school for?" he wrote one night. "I swear I can still see the look on your face." Claire read the message 3 times, feeling a heat she hadn't felt in years, and told herself it was harmless. After all, she hadn't met him. Not yet. If Claire's silence was filled with longing, Ethan's was filled with dread. His world, bounded by the glowing rectangle of his computer screen, had begun to turn hostile. The online friends he once trusted now mocked him for every misstep, recording his clumsy gameplay, circulating clips with captions that stung. "Loser," one wrote beneath a video of his character's digital death. Another messaged him privately, "Kill yourself already." Ethan read the words in the dark of his bedroom, headphones off, the house asleep, and felt a hollowness open in his chest. He did not tell his parents. How could he, when they barely noticed him at dinner, when his father seemed perpetually distracted and his mother perpetually sad? To confess his humiliation would be to invite another silence, the pitying kind, and he could not bear that. Instead he invented excuses for why he no longer wore his headset when gaming, why he muted the chat. He laughed along when Anna teased him about living in a cave, though he noticed, with a mix of relief and resentment, that she never asked further. He wanted someone to see him, truly see him, and yet the thought of being seen filled him with terror. Richard, meanwhile, mistook the quiet for peace. After the pitched battles with Anna, after the accusatory looks from Claire, the absence of confrontation felt almost like reprieve. He convinced himself that things were returning to normal, that the summer turbulence was simply a phase, the kind of drama families endured and forgot. He did not notice the new alertness with which Claire guarded her phone, nor the late nights Ethan spent awake, nor the way Anna's silences were not signs of calm but of withdrawal. He believed, because he needed to believe, that silence meant healing. Anna knew better. She saw the cracks widening, even if no one spoke of them. She noticed her mother's faint smile when a new message pinged on her phone, a smile too private to belong to family life. She noticed her brother's dark-circled eyes and the way he flinched when she asked about his friends. And she noticed, most of all, the emptiness in her father's gaze, as if part of him had already left the room. The Andersons moved through July and into August like actors in a play whose script had been lost, each waiting for the other to improvise the next line. On the surface, nothing catastrophic happened. The lawn was mowed, groceries bought, bills paid. Yet beneath the veneer, the silence deepened into something dangerous, a stillness that felt less like calm than like the air before a storm. It was in this silence that the family's separate lives expanded, each member drifting further into private worlds, each secret thickening like storm clouds. And though none of them could yet articulate it, they were all waiting, dreading, perhaps, for the inevitable moment when the silence would shatter. It happened, as these things often do, on a night that had begun in utter banality. Claire had made spaghetti because it was easy and because everyone would eat it without complaint. Richard had picked up a bottle of red wine on his way home, a peace offering he didn't know how to deliver. Anna was already at the table, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone with a theatrical sigh, while Ethan hovered in the doorway as if gauging the temperature of the room before deciding whether to enter. Nothing about the evening announced itself as a turning point. It was simply another Tuesday in August, humid and unremarkable. And yet, the air felt brittle, charged with the kind of static that precedes a thunderstorm. Richard poured himself a glass of wine, then one for Claire, who accepted it without meeting his eyes. Anna slurped her water noisily, a performance of disdain. Ethan finally sat down, shoulders hunched, fork already in hand. For several minutes, there was only the clink of cutlery and the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then Anna, as if unable to tolerate the silence one moment longer, yanked out her earbuds and said, "So, Dad, how's the girlfriend?" The word detonated in the room. Richard froze, fork suspended. Claire's glass paused halfway to her lips. Ethan looked up, startled, then quickly looked down again, as if the safest place was his plate. "What?" Richard managed, his voice too sharp to sound innocent. "Don't play dumb." Anna's tone was almost gleeful, as though she had been waiting for this. "You come home late, you smell like beer and perfume, you're practically glowing with guilt. Do you really think we don't notice?" Claire set her glass down carefully, so carefully it was almost worse than if she had slammed it. "Anna," she said softly, warningly. But Anna was relentless. "Oh, come on, Mom. You know it too. You've known for weeks. You just don't want to say it out loud because that would make it real." Richard's face flushed a deep, furious red. "That's enough." "No, it's not enough," Anna shot back. "It's disgusting. You spend your whole life lecturing me about responsibility, about working hard, about doing the right thing, and meanwhile you're sneaking around with some office bimbo. You're a hypocrite, that's what you are, a liar and a hypocrite." The words hung there, vibrating. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Claire, expecting, hoping, for her to intervene. But Claire, at long last, spoke not with denial but with a calm that chilled him. "She's right," she said. The table went utterly still. Ethan's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against the plate. Richard stared at his wife. "Claire, I've known," she said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the room. "I've known for a while. I just thought," she broke off, inhaled, steadied herself. "I thought if I ignored it, it might pass. That you might remember who you were. Who we were." Richard felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He wanted to deny, to protest, to blame stress, boredom, loneliness, anything but himself. Yet the look in Claire's eyes told him denial was useless. She had already tried to forgive him silently, and he had squandered even that. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice small and cracked, Ethan whispered, "I can't do this anymore." All eyes turned to him. He looked pale, stricken, as if he had been carrying something heavy for too long. "You're all so busy hating each other, you don't even notice me. Do you even know what's been happening to me? Do you even care?" His voice rose, trembling. "They tell me to kill myself. Every night, online. My friends, they laugh at me, they record me, they tell me I'm worthless. And you don't see it. You don't see anything." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Anna's bravado faltered. Richard, stunned, could only stare at his son, the words crashing over him like waves. "Ethan," Claire began, but he shook his head violently, pushing back from the table. "No, don't act like you care now. You're too busy with your stupid affairs and your stupid arguments. You don't see me. You never see me. His chair screeched against the floor as he stood, and then he was gone, pounding up the stairs, door slamming with a force that rattled the frames on the walls. The silence that followed was unbearable. Claire sat rigid, tears slipping silently down her face. Anna looked stricken, as though she had meant to wound her father but had instead set the whole family bleeding. Richard, for once, had no words. He felt gutted, hollowed out, the image of his son's anguish replaying again and again in his mind. The spaghetti cooled on the table, uneaten. The wine sat untouched in its glasses. And the Andersons, who had spent so long avoiding words, now found themselves drowning in them. Words spoken too late, too brutally, with no way to be unsaid. The house was quieter than it had any right to be after such a storm. The plates from the ruined dinner were still stacked on the counter, half scraped, the smell of charred onions lingering like a reproach. No one had bothered with dishes. The silence itself felt rehearsed, as if each member of the family had silently agreed that the only way to survive the fallout was to retreat to private corners. Richard sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey that burned more than it comforted. His hand shook slightly when he raised it to his lips. He was replaying the scene at the table. Anna's fury, Claire's bitter restraint, Ethan's sudden, unbearable sobs. He had never wanted to be a cruel man. He had wanted, stupidly, to be free. But freedom had turned to ash in his mouth. Claire, upstairs in the bedroom she now refused to share with him, sat propped against a stack of pillows, a book open on her lap but unread. Her gaze kept wandering to the empty half of the bed. For years she had believed in endurance. That marriage was less about joy than about persistence, about surviving disappointment until it dulled. But the dinner had cracked something irreparable. She could not tell if what she felt now was grief, or liberation, or merely exhaustion. Anna had fled to her room with the righteous finality of someone who still believed in clean breaks. She was drafting a long email to a friend back at college, a manifesto disguised as a diary entry. "My parents," she typed, "are exactly the thing I'm fighting against. Hypocrisy made flesh." She deleted the line, rewrote it, deleted it again. Beneath her fury, though, was a tenderness she would not admit, that same tenderness that had made her want to protect Ethan at the table, that gnawed at her now as she imagined him alone. And Ethan was alone, in the basement, staring at the blue glow of his computer screen. He was in a chat window with a stranger who called themselves Orion84. They were talking about video games, but every few lines Orion slipped in a question: "Are you okay? Do you feel safe?" Ethan didn't answer. His fingers hovered, then retreated. The tears had dried into tight tracks on his cheeks. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay invisible. The family drifted through the next day like satellites that had lost their orbit. No one mentioned the dinner. No one mentioned anything at all. Richard went to the office early and returned late. Claire moved wordlessly through her librarian's routines. Anna stormed out for a protest meeting and came back at midnight smelling of cold air and cigarettes. Ethan skipped school, unnoticed. And yet the fault lines remained, jagged, invisible cracks running under the house, under their lives. It was impossible to say whether they were drifting toward collapse or toward some new equilibrium. The future hung uncertain, as fragile and weighty as the air before a storm. One evening, 3 days later, Claire came home to find Ethan waiting at the kitchen table. He didn't speak at first, just sat with his shoulders hunched, his eyes raw. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely audible. "Mom," he said, "I don't want to be alone anymore." It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was a plea, and in the silence that followed, Claire understood that despite everything, the betrayals, the distance, the unbearable weight of disappointment, their story was not over. Because families rarely end with explosions. More often, they endure through the slow work of patching, through fragile truces and the stubborn refusal to let go. The house was still cracked, but it was standing. For now.